Welcome to our PowerPoint module for this week on migration and health. So this is in some ways a continuation of our discussion on race and ethnicity, but much more specific to people who migrate, right? And what are the health implications of migration to and from the US or any other place around the globe? We are going to focus more specifically on immigrants into the US and more specifically on Latino immigrants into the US and the health disparities that exist among migrants or people native to the US, and also how the process of migration is related to health. More specifically, our objectives for this week are first to review frameworks for immigration and health research. And this was in one of your readings. Both of them discussed frameworks for immigration and health. Consider the social determinants of health in each phase of migration, and then also discuss the impacts. This is a more specific example we'll go through. Discuss the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on migrant workers in the US. I do expect that this is going to actually take a little over an hour, closer to an hour and a half, because I do have a documentary for you to watch that is nearly an hour long. But I'm trying to keep the front end shorter so that you really just are the main thing you're using time on is the documentary itself. As usual, you have your reading question due Monday evening, your PowerPoint module due Tuesday evening, and there are only 2 questions for you to respond to in this module, and you don't have any assignments due on Friday, October 2nd. I do want to draw your attention to an upcoming assignment. So this is not due this week. It's due in a few weeks on October 16th, but it is a course paper rough draft, which means you should probably be starting it a bit sooner than the 15th or the 16th. Start thinking about this now if you haven't started already. Do follow the structure described in the course paper prompt that is already on Inquire. That is something that you've had since the second week of class. And I do ask that you use only scholarly sources in your rough draft and of course in your final paper. I did say that I would talk more about what a scholarly source entails, how to identify a scholarly source, how to determine whether something is actually scholarly or whether it's something for a popular audience. So I'm going to talk about that in the next few slides. So what is a scholarly source? There are a few common types of scholarly sources that I am listing here, but know that a scholarly source is a source that is not only reliable, but also written for a more scholarly or academic audience. And so scholarly sources, typically we think of peer-reviewed journal articles, and there are many journals that exist on the topic of public health. And even more specifically, the social determinants of health. So for example, the American Journal of Public Health, this is a peer-reviewed journal article. Social Science and Medicine, the International Journal of Epidemiology, and there are so many more public health scholarly sources. We actually do have a LibGuide for public health, which I will bring up in class in the coming weeks so you know that that's there. And that's where you can find a number of journal articles. In addition, published books. So in the library, I know that access to the library is a little more limited this semester, but there also are ebooks that you can access that are scholarly sources. And finally, government sources. And this is the one that gets a little bit tricky. So publications from the CDC, such as the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, or MMWR. That is a government source. It's coming from the CDC. Publications from the National Institutes of Health, really anything ending in .gov, the Virginia Department of Health as well. This is where it gets tricky for government sources though. Government sources are considered to be reliable, okay? Even in this unreliable time. But many government sources are actually popular sources meant for a general audience and not scholarly sources. So again, this is where it gets tricky. So let me show you an example to help you distinguish between a scholarly and a popular source. But first, some definitions. A popular source is typically written for a general audience. It is not peer-reviewed. Typically, you don't see documentation of evidence in the form of citations, in-text citations. That's one way to pick out whether you're looking at a popular or a scholarly source. If there are no citations, it's probably a popular source. These are sometimes written by experts. So for example, written by experts at the CDC. These are reliable, they are written by experts, but they aren't necessarily scholarly. And again, I will show you an example in the next slide. WebMD, not a scholarly source. This is a popular source. That is one common example of a popular source that you should not use for a research paper. Scholarly sources, on the other hand, are written by experts. They are peer-reviewed, meaning that before they are published, other experts review them. They do document sources of evidence, so you will see in-text citations in a scholarly source, and they are written for an academic or professional audience. Now, on the next slide, I'm going to show you an example of the same topic, but one popular source and one scholarly source. Now, I know that these are very small on your screen, and I don't expect you to be able to read everything that is on each of these examples, but just by looking at these, you can tell that they are very different publications. They're different types of publications meant for a different audience. So the popular source is on the left. This is a CDC fact sheet. So it's coming from the CDC. It is reliable, but it is not scholarly. And there are a few things that you can easily pull out here to determine that this is not scholarly. One, I mean, usually, when you see a lot of generic stock photos on a source, that is one clue that it's probably not a scholarly source. Not always, but most of the time. You don't see them using in-text citations here. It's in note form. It's definitely meant for a popular audience. So this would be a popular source. Even though it's coming from the CDC, we can trust it, but we wouldn't use it in a research paper. On the other hand, you see on the right side what we would consider to be a scholarly source. This is also coming from the CDC. This is from Emerging Infectious Disease. This is a CDC journal, but it's a very different format, right? We do see, at least if I squint, can see some in-text citations in there. I know it's very small, but it is written in an academic journal format. So this clearly looks very different from the CDC fact sheet on gonorrhea. Here we are looking at an academic journal article, and this is a scholarly source. Now, these are pretty obvious examples, I think. If you are not sure, you have a source and you can't really tell, there are some that seem to hang somewhere in the middle. So if you aren't sure if you have a scholarly source or a popular source, send it to me and please ask, is this something that I can use in my paper for this course? All right? Please let me know if you have questions on using sources at any point. Here's your opening question for this week, and it is a pretty broad one. In what ways is migration a social determinant of health? So anything that you gathered really from the readings for this week, or anything you've gathered from other courses or from other lessons that make sense here, okay? So you can pause the PowerPoint module here, answer this opening question, and then come back when you're done. Now, with globalization, which is the increased interconnectedness across countries, across regions of the world, migration has become far more commonplace, right? Whether it is permanent migration from one country to another country, whether it is migration within a country, or whether it is transient migration that includes maybe seasonal migration from one country and then returning to the country of origin. So migration is a huge part of our globalized world. And here you see, this is from the Pew Research Center. In 2017, there were 49,780,000 people living in the US who were born in another country. All right, and this shows you patterns or where the countries of origin are primarily. So Mexico, for example, is a significant country of origin for a lot of migrants in the US. Okay, so migration is a huge part of our globalized society. And a huge chunk of our population is an immigrant population. And there are several guiding frameworks for thinking about how migration is connected to health. And these were outlined in one of your readings for this week. The first and probably the most common framework that we see applied in public health literature and social science literature more broadly is the behavioral framework. And this, as you got from the reading, this does have some significant limitations. Here we are assuming that immigrant health is shaped by individual behavior, individual behavioral choices. And then the primary focus here for uh, mitigating health inequities or poor health among migrants is behavior, so changing behaviors, maybe through education on nutrition or parenting or on the importance of health screenings and so on. But this is the most popular framework in a lot of the literature, but also if we're thinking about the social determinants of health as our primary perspective in this course, this is a rather limited view because we're focused on individuals and changing individual behavior. This is one component of public health and understanding health inequalities and health disparities. So next we have the cultural framework. And this is, getting a little bit more macro. We're talking about shared beliefs, values, customs, and so on that do shape health, but also somewhat limited, especially when cultures are reduced to these very simplistic, essential components that really don't represent the variety that exists within an entire, say, country, a broader culture of people. The cultural framework does also consider the role of assimilation and acculturation in changing health behaviors. And assimilation we typically define as the loss of behavioral practices from a country of origin to assimilate or fit in with the destination country's culture. Acculturation is the adoption of behavioral practices from the destination country. So one is assimilation is sort of loss of practices from the country of origin or culture of origin, you might say. And then acculturation is adopting new practices and new health behaviors, for example, connected to the destination country. There's a lot of research on this as well. So how US culture affects, the engagement in health behaviors for various cultures. It's connected to the behavioral framework in this way. It's a little bit more individually focused. Now, finally, and this is the one that really the authors focus on for that reading you did, finally we have the structural framework. And this is considering how broader social conditions shape immigrant health. This is really the core of the social determinants of health, if we're thinking about the social determinants of health in connection to migration. We can consider how healthcare systems and interaction with healthcare systems is related to health. The economy more broadly and economic structure, the politics of a place, because the politics of a place may shape the ability for an immigrant to really interact with the economy or with the healthcare system of a destination country. So we can also consider here how immigration status intersects with institutions. So being an immigrant in the US, what does that mean for being able to navigate and enter the healthcare system? What does that mean for being able to vote? What does it mean for being able to gain employment and the types of employment that are typically available? We also need to consider the role of discrimination here in restricting opportunity for a number of migrants in the US. Okay, so a structural framework is much more macro-oriented and it's much more aligned with the social determinants of health perspective. We can also consider how migration as a process is related to health. And there are multiple phases of migration. Each of these has unique implications for health. And at each step of the way, there is the potential for a serious health crisis that then is going to affect the next stage and the next stage after that in the migration process. So the phases of migration that were reviewed in your other reading for this week include pre-departure. So that's really about the social conditions in the place of origin. So in the country of origin, economic conditions, we can think about the health system, perhaps political unrest that is forcing migration. So we have forced migrants in that example. So pre-departure conditions are important in predicting the potential path for migration, as well as perhaps leading to health conditions that are then exacerbated or affected by future stages or phases of the migration process. So we can also think about travel, and this may be really what we think about. It's what comes to mind for me in thinking about health and health concerns and safety concerns in the migration process, potentially. So travel between the place of origin and destination, here there are opportunities or the potential for health conditions to arise related to the safety of the transit, the distance or the time required for transit, vulnerability to violence. And this is really where transit assistance is so important to promote health in this stage. Transit assistance either being something that is public and supported by a government or something that is private or a nonprofit. There are many transit assistance nonprofits that exist in the US to really help migrants in the process of travel. Next, we have destination. Once a migrant reaches the intended location, what is the economic and social atmosphere like? Is there healthcare that is available to an immigrant? Are there other health promoting resources available? On the flip side, is there heightened discrimination for migrants? We certainly see this in the US for non-white migrants, specifically for Hispanic and Latino migrants. Are there also changes in health-related behavior due to acculturation in this new destination? And what is the cultural climate like? So that is in part the cultural perspective or framework in looking at migration, also structural. And then for some migrants, there is also the interception phase. And this is really the other thing that I think about, especially today, given the rise of ICE detention centers in the US. Interception is about or regarding those who have been detained in the receiving country. In 2019 alone, over 500,000 people were detained and kept within ICE facilities at some point during the year. So 500,000 people. This is a major system in the US, and it is often very closely aligned with our criminal justice system, except there are far fewer legal protections for migrants into the US compared to US citizens. So interception is one that we are also going to talk about for this week. And then finally, for some migrants, we also have return, and that is returning to the place or country of origin. And this can either be temporary or permanent. For example, we do have a number of seasonal migrant workers in the US who will come to, for example, do farm work during certain seasons in the year, maybe half of the year, quarter of the year, and may migrate from Mexico or Latin America and then return to their home and their families at the end of the growing season. So we do see a number of migrant workers who do jump back and forth across countries. This has unique health implications as well, given the frequency of travel, given the separation potentially from families, separation from culture. And so there are a number of ways in which the return process can also have implications for health. I do want to switch gears here a little bit and address a really current issue in the US in particular, and that is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on migrant workers, including migrant farm workers, workers in the meatpacking industry, and other places where there are a lot of essential workers that we need in order for our food supply to continue, in order to have a stable food supply. However, we have been seeing time and time again that these workers are really put at a lot of risk given the pandemic and put in unsafe living and working situations on a day-to-day basis. There have been a number of outbreaks, epidemics within various farm workers, within plants. A number of different employers have reported outbreaks, but also these are severely underreported because of the implications for these industries. All right, so I do want to spend some time on migrant workers and how COVID-19 has really put these workers at great risk. This is what the documentary you're about to watch is all about. So now is the time when you are going to pause the module and watch a 55-minute documentary. So it is a pretty significant film in terms of length, but it is a very important topic, and it's one that I do want to discuss further in class. So this will help to set us up. As you watch the documentary, I want you to answer the following questions here, but also take other notes. Take notes as you watch. Here's the question I have for you, or questions. What factors put migrant workers at greater risk of contracting COVID-19? What could be done to reduce COVID-19 risk for these workers? And they are going to talk about these topics as well as others. And I also will share that some of this documentary is disturbing, and we do see human rights violations, and really the risk that these workers are forced to put themselves in order to feed their families and in order to stay in the country. So, I mean, I think it is a very important topic and one we're going to discuss further. So pause here, watch the documentary, and answer this question on Inquire. So that's all I have for you for the module for this week, because I know you did just watch that rather long documentary. So there is no closing question. We're just going to stop here. Remember, in class this week, or for class this week, we're going to have our in-class group on Wednesday and our Zoom group on Friday, just like we did last week. We are going to talk about a more specific topic I want you to be prepared to discuss in class. We're going to discuss the unique risks of COVID-19 infection for Latino immigrants in the U.S., including those who are workers in the U.S. and for some in unsafe working conditions. And we're also going to talk about those ICE immigration detention centers and really the huge risk that people in detention centers are facing right now, given the conditions within those centers and given the pandemic, obviously. So we will talk about those topics in class. Please do come prepared to discuss. I will see you either in the classroom or on Zoom.